Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Carrick Longley, who is the founder and CEO of ZenithFlow, a company pioneering privacy-first AI solutions for strategic communications. Carrick Longley, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Really excited to be here. I'm glad we could finally connect and looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, yeah. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Carrick, will cover influence automation and LLM technology. We've not had a, specific LLM discussion yet on the Cognitive Crucible. So this is something that is going to help fill a gap in the forum corpus, if you will. So, but before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Yeah, this is an incredibly exciting time, I think, from both where we are in terms of the advancement of technology and access to information. I think it's also can be an incredibly scary times, if you will. The access to tools like the ones that we're getting ready to talk about, I think, in greater detail. I think have the profound ability to fundamentally change the nature of how we operate, not just from a pure defense perspective, but in everyday life. And I think we're already seeing this with how these types of tools are being used in education and private lives and even work. How we employ these tools, I think, as we move forward holistically, or as a whole of society, I think will really be interesting to see how things unfold. I'm very bullish about the benefits of these types of tools, but I'm not walking in blindly to the potential for disrupting all kinds of industries and how people work and how people do a whole range of activities and what. And we have to be, I think, cognizant of the potential ramifications for how this may change the very way we work and live. In particular in the national security space, I think we're at a pretty interesting point where the playing field has been leveled in many regards in terms of our peer competitors and their access to these types of tools. I mean, it is no surprise that if you look into the space of artificial intelligence, there are really two dominant countries that are investing heavily in this type of technology. One is the United States, the other is China. If you look at all of the academic research, I think the overwhelming majority actually is coming out of China and a lot of Chinese universities on the advancements of large language models and the advancements of image generation technology that would allow you to do things like deep fakes and others if it's trained for bad. But I think there is no getting around the reality that there are largely two big countries investing an enormous amount of money into the space. It's the U.S. and China, and the adoption of tools and the policies that govern them. I don't know that they've necessarily caught up, specifically within the U.S. national security space. So hopefully that gives a little bit of sort of where I think things are. In short, very exciting times to be living in, can be mildly terrifying at times if you think about the implications for how these tools can be used. And it absolutely feels like a new arms race, if you will, on the level of investment and work that is being poured into it from two of the largest economies in the world.
Yeah, that's cool. And but before we go any further, I should have asked this a little bit more right there at the intro. But could you take a moment? So your company name is ZenithFlow. I'd love to know a little bit more about why you chose that name. But also, could you take just a moment, Carrick, and give just a little bit more of your background so the audience knows who you
Yeah,
are
yeah,
and
yeah, for sure.
where you've been. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a little bit of background. So, I started my career was a signals intelligence ground electronic warfare officer in the Marine Corps. Did one stint at a radio battalion, and then ended up going to the Naval Postgraduate School, where I spent the next 4.5 years in residence there,
Is that
working on a
right? Wow. Excellent.
master's
Yeah.
degree in information warfare systems engineering, and then I got extended to work on my doctorate in information sciences. So
Is that right?
left, yeah.
What time period was that?
So that was in 2008 to the middle of 2012 is when
Okay.
I was there. Very
Okay.
beginning of 2008 to 2012. Loved my time there. Really got exposed to a lot of creative thinkers. Got exposed to actually the Joint Service far more than I had in my previous deployment as lieutenant. Because at the Naval Postgrad School, you have not only all four services are represented from from the now five, but at the time there were only four services
Hmm.
represented there. A lot of international officers, and then academics that were from all over, and a lot of technology companies. Given your proximity to Silicon Valley, we had a lot of really interesting crossover between the academic research, the defense-focused academic research that was out there, and I loved my time out at Monterey. When I was there, I ended up starting a research project. It was all focused on field data collection. That's been my passion has been on building tools and technologies to solve specific problems that we faced in the field. And in that time, I had just come off a deployment in Iraq where I'd observed that a lot of our collection approaches were very manual. And at the time, this was right when the first iPhone was being launched. Shortly after I came back from Iraq and said, well, I can see a world in which we're able to use these devices to do data collection. Now that's kind of old hat at this point. Everyone uses phones for everything and you use all kinds of apps, but at the time it was somewhat novel. So started a project there. That's where I really started getting into, I think my first software development-ish flavor started back in 2008. I was a terrible coder. I was really good at hacking things together, but not actually building the tools. But fast forward to spend a couple of years at MARSOC, and then came up to the Marine Corps Information Operations Center, did a deployment as a technical IO officer for the 24th MU, came back, and then decided that I wanted to stay in the information operations, information advantage space. And made the decision that I was going to do so as a reservist. So I dropped in the reserves, went to work for IST Research, and joined IST in 2016. We were not I think we were less than 20 employees at the time, 15, 16, something like that. And my focus was again focused on overseas data collection, and many of the listeners here might be familiar with the Pulse system. I was one of the early product owners of Pulse, and helping shape where we were going
Hmm.
with those tools. My interest again on that data collection engagement side. I was really focused on the engagement side of the house, like how do you connect with and message audiences? Because I had just spent basically the last 8 years in the Marine Corps as an
Hmm.
information operations professional. And coming out of so focused on the engagement, then I started to see how real-time bidding and advertising was starting to be leveraged heavily in the private sector, but the defense sector, I think, was frankly behind the pace, and worked to bring in some of the first demand-side platforms for doing ad delivery to drive audiences into certain messages or channels wherever it was you were going. Um, was there at IST. We were acquired in 2020 by the Carlyle Group, merged with 26 Research, or 26 Labs rather, became 26 Technologies. Stayed there for another 3 years as they continued to grow and do great things. And then I've had this burning desire to go out on my own. And so I had left 26, took a little bit of hiatus from the field, went over to work for a zero trust security company. But I had shortly before departing, I had founded ZenithFlow, which gets to one of your other questions.
Yeah.
Founded ZenithFlow, and at the time was kind of focused on marketing automation, where that was one of the things that I had been working on for many years. And this probably goes back all the way to 2008 and even beyond before, was on automating a lot of digital processes. So RPA is an entire field, robotic process automation. It was the sort of old school name. Now it's just automation. But so founded this company, and then after leaving 26, I really started to think about where things were in this space, and where the gap was. And right about that same time, I started teaching at the University of Mary Washington in an intro to computer science class using Python. Large language models were really starting to come into the forefront of conversations across the board. And I was really, really interested in understanding how LLMs could be used for code completion and code development. And then everything sort of fell into place from there, where my interests professionally and personally happen to align on what I perceived as a gap in the space. And that's where the core platform and product StoryForge were born from some of that idea. The name ZenithFlow is there's a couple of things. One, went with the colors black and pink, because if you look out at any GovCon space, you're going to see lots and lots of blue and gray. You're going to see a lot of green. You don't see a whole lot of pink. And so
Okay. Okay.
just from a pure marketing, it was like, let's do something that looks different.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Let's stand out. Right. Yeah.
just stand out, something to stand out and not look like all the others. And the flow part of it is for like process and automation. The Zenith was there's a couple of different definitions. There's the astronomy definition, the point in the sky that's directly above an observer is the zenith. It's also the time at which something is most powerful or successful is the zenith. So the idea is like, how can you try to evoke the images of becoming more powerful or having a better observation by automating things? So that's really where a lot of
Okay.
the philosophy came from, and where the name. I always liked the letter Z. Not enough companies that start with the letter Z. It's terrible if we're operating from the old phone book days, where
Yeah.
we're the
Yeah.
absolute last in the phone book. But I just something different, right?
Yeah.
I wanted
No.
to be
Yeah.
something
Yep.
different.
Yep, that's something noteworthy. That's good. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for that recap. And I can I can definitely see that there's a through line from your work in the Marines and your education, your previous private sector work, all the way through to today as well. So, but let's if we could, Carrick, start with, I don't know, some kind of like a little bit of a 101. So how do you describe LLM technology? And then also maybe get a little bit into how you think LLMs are changing the national security landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is a lot of hype and a lot of snake oil in this space, but there's a lot of really valuable tech as well. So, I think starting off at first principles, so a large language model is nothing more than an AI system that's trained on a vast amount of text to understand and generate human language. That's fundamentally what it is. It helps the models work because they recognize patterns and data rather than following explicit rules. So if you think about an LLM, it's a prediction engine that's trained on books, articles, websites, conversations, scraped forms, you name it. And what it's doing is it is predicting the next word or token in a sequence. So because of this massive training, that's where the large comes in. The massive, enormous training set, it allows it to generate, these models are allowed to generate coherent text. They can answer questions. They can help you translate languages, write code, and then even simulate expertise across a range of domains. Like that's the most basic building block. Now, there are almost infinite ways that this can get parsed in and improved in ways that everything from the underlying technology to how you combine different models together to the size of the models to how you compress models. But at the most fundamental level, an LLM is just a large model that runs on a computer. It requires GPU or graphics processing units because of all the mathematical computations. And all it is really doing is predicting the next most likely token. That's all they do. Now, even though that sounds like, well, that's all they do, I don't think it's any surprise to any of the listeners of this that they can generate some incredibly powerful outputs. In fact, one of the things that I think is probably where it's making the most impact is on the ability to generate code. It truly is starting to, I think, disrupt and change the way software development is happening.
Mm.
And that's where I think a lot of the a lot of the conversation is focused on how it's being used for writing in schools or writing articles or proposal generate whatever. But I think where it actually truly does excel is on the code side of the house. But that's what an LLM is.
Okay, excellent. So, as you mentioned, I mean, there's a little bit of like shiny object syndrome, I guess executives and are, just clamoring to their teams, we got to get some LLM stuff going, or can can you sprinkle some LLM dust on this and upgrade our systems, or what have you. But so in that vein, what are some suggestions that you have for leaders on implementing LLM technology and AI agents within their business or national security organization?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And first and foremost, oftentimes it's pitched as a solution in search of a problem.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Not every solution requires a large language model to get the output that you're looking for.
Uh-huh.
So I think you have to start with the end in mind. What is the thing you're trying to solve? And
Hmm.
then need to determine if, in fact, a large language model in some capacity, whether it's as like the one-shot prompt to get the answer, or as a component of a much larger system, is in fact the right solution. LLMs have, yeah,
Could I ask you, you said something just then, what, and I've heard this before, but I don't quite understand it. What do you mean when you say one shot
yeah.
in the LLM context?
Yeah, a one shot prompt or one shot prompting is where you essentially you give one instruction to a model, whether it's a very large instruction or you've got data, and you're taking the output directly as it comes out. You're not giving It's not a chain of prompts. So I'm not asking you, and it's like in a conversation.
Mm.
I ask you one question and you give me your response, and that's it. That is a one shot or a single shot prompt. As opposed to where if we're building a conversation, I may ask you a question, you respond, I'll interpret, then I'll ask you another question, you respond. So we are chaining together a conversation or chaining together prompts. So that would be where prompt chaining comes in. It's a technique that if you fire up ChatGPT right now, or Claude
Mhm.
or Gemini, or insert your LLM flavor of the day that you want to use, and you just say, write an article about X, and you give it no other instructions or no other data, and the article comes back, that is a single shot or a one shot prompt.
Oh, it's so contrasting that with, giving the model some context behind your question, like I'm a business owner in, doing this kind of work. I'm interested in these kinds of outcomes, and then asking the question, would that still be considered one shot, or is that
Yeah,
chain?
that would still be one shot, but then if you took and then if you took the output from that, and before you pass it to the user, you said, from this output, I want you to extract the following key insights and structure it this way. So maybe you had a second set of instructions. Those
Mhm.
two steps, and then the output there, that would no longer be a single shot. So
Okay.
yeah, so it really is. It's and I think the point where it gets back into why does any of that matter. So to your question of
Hmm. Hmm.
let's sprinkle some LLMs on it.
Yeah.
One, you have to determine the problem you're trying to solve is, then identifying what the right tool to be used here, and it may in fact be an LLM. And if you can solve the problem with a single shot, great. If there's too much variability in that, then maybe you need to use a series of prompts or a series of steps that are used to transform data. And in not every case are you going to use chaining LLMs together. Like, in fact, a lot of the automation processes and tools that are being used are they're an LLM is only one small component in a much larger sort of automated workflow. Maybe it's a very critically important part of it, but it's data cleaning. By and large, LLMs are terrible at data cleaning.
Mm.
Even a lot of you get a lot of prompt leakages, you got a lot of bogus text that comes in. So you often have to fall back, if you're a Python developer like me, you fall back to using a variety of regular expression techniques and other libraries to clean text. None of that has anything to do with an LLM. It's just part of the process to go from an input. How can I reliably get the output to solve the problem that I need in a
Hmm.
structured way?
Hmm. All right. Yeah. And yeah, I saw you a couple of weeks ago. And by the way, we're recording this on March 26th, 2025. But I saw you a couple of weeks ago at a conference in London, the Phoenix Challenge conference, and you gave a talk. And one of the key takeaways I got from your talk, or one of the upfront takeaways, I should say, you mentioned this very early, was if you can implement LLM, the simpler the better when
100%.
implementing LLM related technology. Do you think you could give just a beat on that? Why do you say that? And uh, uh, in the same kind of context as advice to leaders who are interested in implementing LLM technology?
For sure, and I think this is true, and certainly I can say that it's true in software development that I've observed for many years, predating LLMs and the use of them. But there is a tendency to try to over-engineer particular solutions or get very, very elegant with the implementation of something when oftentimes simpler can be better. So I said this in the context of, or where some of this has come from. And so within the large language model domain, there are a number of frameworks, automation frameworks, agent-based frameworks that have been created. If you spend any time in this space, you'll run across things like LangChain, LangGraph,
Mm, hmm.
Crew AI, and others. And while I think some of them are very interesting projects from how they've tried to abstract away the dirtiness or the muckiness of working with these different tools under the hood, in many cases, I think these tend to overcomplicate and end up with over-engineered solutions where you have these very heavy, bulky solutions to problems where there's a lot of fragility in there. It's really hard to debug what's going on. You really don't know if I've abstracted away how I'm interacting with the base model. I really have no idea what parameters are being passed somewhere along the chain. So the simpler you can make the solution, in many cases, the better. So, and again, this kind of ties in with not every solution requires the LLM hammer. But when you are designing something that uses large language models, you don't always need to go with these really bespoke solutions that typically could be over-engineered. So a lot of first principles, like starting with the smallest possible model, the cheapest, fastest model you can, and then uh, and then determining what kind of, can I adjust the inputs and can I adjust the outputs based on some of the parameters I'm providing, whether that's in your prompt instructions, et cetera. And there was a whole field, I think that came and is probably largely on its way out the door with prompt engineering. So you'll see a lot of conversation about prompt engineering. That's basically the techniques with which you need to provide the instructions and the context to a model in order to get a reliable output that solves the problem you're looking for.
Is that
So
right? So the concept of prompt engineering is becoming passé. That's that's like old school now.
I wouldn't say it's passe entirely, but I would say that I certainly felt like there was this massive focus on prompt
Yeah,
engineering and
yeah,
here are the
yeah.
prompt templates and oh my God, you get to the prompts. But
Uh-huh.
the pace at which the models are advancing and with which they are able to generate outputs based on your inputs, and I would say
I see.
more of the prompt focus now is not on how do you exactly phrase the right words for the
Uh-huh.
prompt. I mean, I think
Uh-huh.
that's still part of it, but trying to provide sufficient context using as little space as possible when you're trying to optimize for speed and performance.
I see.
So
Hmm.
I just a lot of and if you looked at it from the amount of effort that would go into constructing a prompt to get an output from GPT-3 compared to GPT-3.5, compared to
Hmm.
GPT-4, or Sonnet Haiku or Haiku Claude Sonnet or Claude Haiku to Claude Sonnet to Sonnet 3.5 to Sonnet 3.7. You We are able to get with today, you can get away with sloppier and sloppier prompts on the front end and still get high quality outputs. That
That's
was not
amazing.
the case. That was not the case in previous models. And I think a lot of the emphasis on prompt engineering, a lot of the hype that was around it was largely to compensate for some of the shortfalls
I see.
in the quality of the models.
I
But
see.
the quality is dramatically improved. Just in the last 6 months, the
Yeah.
models continue to outpace where I think any of us would have believed they would be at this point.
That is amazing. So d depending upon what circles you're running in and talking about this kind of technology, if you uh, mentioned the phrase prompt engineering, you you might get some funny looks or raised eyebrows, like come on, boomer, let's get with the program here, right? This is that's so 2024. Okay, well, the title of this episode, is about LLM technology and influence. So maybe could you how, how do you take everything that you've been describing and all of this and drop it into the world of influence?
Yeah, so where where as I mentioned briefly, but I can go in a little bit greater detail now is where I saw a gap in the space, and I'm talking about this primarily from observing U.S. Largely U.S. Influence or information related activities. Now, not everything's necessarily influence. Was we have I think an enormous amount of investment in tools that exist to help us understand what is going on in the information environment. A lot of those tools help you collect, excuse me, large amounts of publicly available information, ingesting news sources, event data, et cetera, to try to get to who is talking about what, where, and at what point in time. I mean, that's what they're trying to do fundamentally. Now, there's a lot of nuance in that. There's a ton of work that goes into it, and the investment is absolutely necessary. And there are a lot of companies doing a lot of great work in that space. There are a much smaller group of companies or technologies that allow us to disseminate our message. And when I'm specifically talking about how do I get, when I try to communicate an idea to an audience, whether it's a public awareness campaign or a health campaign, or I'm trying to do a surrender appeal, whatever it may be, right? And it doesn't matter if you're doing psychological operations, public affairs, strategic communication, behavior change communication. At the end of the day, you're trying to communicate an idea to an audience. There are some tools, a limited set of tools and technologies that help you deliver that. And that could be everything from scheduling and posting content on various social media sites, tools that allow you to disseminate automated messages over, social chat programs like WhatsApp or Signal or SMS messaging, or hooks into newspapers and advertising platforms, et cetera. The dissemination. What I found though was in that middle. Once you understand who is talking about what, and you have to craft a message, whether that's a
Hmm.
briefing or a
Hmm.
press release or a series of messages. There was so little focus on how do we actually make those messages more resonant, more relevant, tailorable, and focused on that audience, and do so in a structured way where I can really ramp up the not only the volume but the quality of the writing in a way that a small team of a few people can generate what would have taken manually many, many, many more people to be able to produce.
Mm.
Interestingly,
What about
um,
speed of
oh,
delivery?
well, without a doubt, the speed of delivery is there. I mean, the once and you start to see now there's the use of LLMs for marketing materials and marketing content is absolutely being used, I think, fairly broadly now. The degree to which it is successful or the work is high quality, I think, is debatable on the implementation and some of the practical application of the tools that we're focused on building now actually stemmed from our early use of this. So from my early use of using like GPT-3 and 3.5 just to generate a little bit of marketing copy to paste somewhere. Um, talking about prompt engineering, back
Hmm.
in the day, i.e. a year ago, back in the day, you would have to spend an enormous amount of time constantly reminding the model who you were, what organization you represented, who your
Oh.
focused audience was that you were trying to communicate with, the style of writing, the emotion you wanted, and you could spend all this time writing up this background that you would have to consistently and constantly go back and remind the audience about. And so as I realized, one, there's not a lot of investment or focus in making the message better. There is a little bit of usage on tools and techniques to start to crack the nut with, well, could we use large language models for doing this writing and content generation? The answer is yes. Then how can we make a process or a tool by which it is much easier for a user to define, here's who I am, here's who my audience is, here's how I
Mm.
want to communicate,
Hmm.
and do that where they're not spending an inordinate amount of time having to talk with a model. They're focusing on the things that actually matter, which
Hmm.
are, what is the message that I'm trying to deliver? What is the behavior that I'm trying to elicit or trying to achieve? And then how can I do that with speed and scale? So that really is that middle piece there. That is the focus of has been a lot of the focus of my work. And because of the nature of the space in which we operate in, my bias has been from the very beginning on doing all of that with models that are resident on the machine on which I am working. So I'm a
Hmm.
bit on the I don't know if you'd call it I'm on the fringe, but I'm certainly not the dominant voice in the field on edge based models. But I do see this is where they are going, where a good bit of the certainly on the content generation side is going, is the speed at which we're able to build models, the quality with which we're able to compress these models and make more and more capable models that are smaller and smaller in size. The
Could I ask a little sidebar on that? When
Sure.
you say, we build models, are you talking about like other providers of these kinds of models, or are you talking about like you and your outfit, you're building models?
Yeah, sorry, I'm speaking in the broad sense of
Okay.
of the space with foundational frontier models.
Okay. Okay.
It is worth mentioning there, a major amount of investment has gone into building these foundation models. I think
Hmm.
it's the names that you'll come across. I think are almost very common in these circles. It's OpenAI, it's Anthropic, it's Mistral, it's Meta. And there
Hmm.
are a
Hmm.
fewer smaller ones, smaller research groups, et cetera. DeepSeek is another one that's been all over LinkedIn lately on the
Oh,
hysteria with that.
that's the Chinese
Yep.
group
Yeah, the Chinese quant-based group. Yep.
that created such a splash about a month ago or so.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly it. And there are others. There are other ones that are out there. But
Do you,
so
sorry, sidebar on a sidebar. Do you have a uh, I mean, could you describe briefly what that news splash was, and do you have any kind of like a judgment on what the ruckus was?
Yeah, all right, couple things. So DeepSeek is the DeepSeek reasoning model, which was released a couple months ago.
Hmm.
The big splash there was the headline came out and said, we effectively DeepSeek was able to train a reasoning model that was as good, if not better, than what OpenAI's O1 reasoning model was, at a fraction of the cost. Now, a lot of the headline about the fraction of the cost had to do with that they claimed it was, only cost them $10 million. And this obviously is happening in a country where the U.S. has put controls on access
Mm.
to high performing GPUs, et cetera. So there's a whole political aspect that's happening there. The other part of this is that, well, then there came the question of the data privacy. If you're using the cloud-based DeepSeek model, if you look in the fine print, all of your prompts, all of your data is being shipped back to servers that are in China. And there was a whole question about the privacy tied to that one. The
Mm.
thing that got most of the hysteria, however, was if you asked the model about Tiananmen Square, it would be evasive or it wouldn't answer. And
Ah.
everyone said, see, look, it is censored.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Now, that is true. I am not debating that it did not happen. I will say, if you use Claude or Gemini or OpenAI and you ask it specific questions, about, and I this actually I tested this one with Gemini in particular. This is
Mm-hmm.
Google's one of their advanced models. If you asked it to provide recent executive orders, just trying to and like how many executive orders have been released and what are they, you will get prompt refusals where the model will come back and say, "I'm sorry, I cannot answer that. It's political in nature." So
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit ironic that on the one hand we're going to point fingers and say, see, look, the Chinese are censoring about Tiananmen Square,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same breath, we have U.S. based corporations that also do the same kind of censoring. So
Mm.
I'm not
Is it?
making a
Yeah. Is it? I, I I I just thought about it along these lines. So this is like John Bicknell real-time processing. But um, could you think of these these foundational models as you were describing, like as almost as like channels, like just like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. I'm listing U.S. news sources, but those cable channels have a predictable bias to them. And if you're a savvy consumer of news, then you've got some awareness of the kinds of things that you're likely to hear on CNN that you don't hear on Fox and vice versa. Would it be, I mean, how does it fit for you to think of these LLMs as channels and depending upon who the organizer is, the developer is, the corporate entity that paid for the model, you can almost expect certain kind of bias, using these different LLMs.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to call out, and then it reinforces my position of why I think local models are the way, or models that you have much greater control over.
Hmm.
One, in order to train a model, you have to do it on a very large corpus of data. So understanding that that corpus is biased from the very beginning. So you
Hmm.
just mentioned a variety of news sources. So imagine that I create a new foundational model and I only train it on, conservative news
Hmm.
sources, or
Hmm.
I only train it on liberal news sources, or I only train it on official academic publications or releases from the government of China. You can imagine now that there are inherent biases in
Hmm.
that data which are going to carry forward. So that is one type of bias you need to be aware of. And the other type of bias are on the system instructions that are put into place by the providers themselves. So what do I mean by system instructions? We were just talking about prompt engineering. All of the commercial cloud models, or the majority, I won't say all because I'm sure there may be one or two that allow you to do this. They all have, in most cases, you're providing a prompt that is a user instruction. You, the user, are giving the system an instruction to respond to. The system instruction that defines the essentially the guardrails or upon which how the system is going to respond are controlled and often not publicly known by the providers. So the system instructions for Claude versus OpenAI versus DeepSeek versus others, those are not things that you, the consumer, can see. The difference with a model that you can deploy locally, like a foundational model from Meta, for example, or any number of these other models that you can actually control the system instructions that are being provided to the model. And in many cases, even if there are guardrails that are embedded into how the system is trained, there are techniques for essentially removing the guardrails or ablating the model or uncensoring that model. So a very long-winded way of saying, if you look at the space, one of the things you have to acknowledge is that they're trained on data that is fundamentally biased.
Hmm.
Two, they're
Hmm.
being served by corporations or companies that further put their own controls on the types of outputs for very good reasons that they may have about why they would want to control the quality or what it can be done with. But all the way through that, if you're building systems that are reliant on a black box where you don't have the same level of control that on there that you may have with something running locally, it absolutely can raise a flag. A lot of the just to close the thought on the
Hmm.
DeepSeek thing, a lot of the I think outrage had to do with the quote censorship on there. I think more of it should be focused on how how you can bootstrap model training off of somebody else's massive investment, because they are essentially what essentially I think actually happened is DeepSeek was able to use OpenAI's APIs to generate synthetic data to enable it to then train. So it's a process called distillation. That I think is the real story that got lost amongst the weeds. Is
That's that's
effectively, yeah,
that's called distillation. So
distillation. Yeah.
using LLM technology to generate synthetic training data, which then gets fed back in to create foundational models. That's distillation.
Yeah, so essentially, distillation.
Huh.
In this context, it's a technique where you can make smaller, more efficient models,
Mm.
learn to mimic the behavior of a larger, more complex model. That was the real story here. Is that
Ah.
why DeepSeek was able to train a model for $10 million without the billions of investment? Is that they're using distillation. They're leveraging someone else's investment to build a much more smaller, efficient model by
Mm.
mimicking that behavior through that distillation. That's the real story. So it's not that they did it for the price, the price they claimed, which I don't know that that's actually true, but I have no way of validating that their investment is what it was. But it's the technique of distillation with the other. But I think more to the point that we've pulled out is that you have to understand that if you train on bias data, the models will carry over some of that inherent bias. And if you apply additional instructions that you and I cannot see, there's additional bias and control being applied on there, and it makes all of that process much more opaque. The difference with models that can be either trained or they can be fine-tuned for a specific purpose is you have much greater control over the inputs and outputs of that system, which is why when you're looking at this whole idea of how do I architect or build a system to solve a particular problem? One, you have to determine if an LLM is even the right component
Hmm.
there. Then
Hmm.
two, you have to figure out which LLM to use and in what step. And then I always advocate for starting small first. So can I start with a small locally running model before I have to scale up to some large computationally expensive cloud-based model? And obviously you have to understand in what context you're trying to employ the solution as as security and data privacy and all the other implications I think get wrapped into that in the conversation as well.
My goodness. All right. Well, uh, super interesting stuff. So, where I guess I want to ask you two kind of wrap up questions. So, uh, these these technologies are getting implemented, right? So what are and you're doing some work with the national security community already. What are, some of the watchwords or cautions or, the kinds of things that you communicate to your customers about, you know, the do's and don'ts of, actually using this kind of technology for real world operations, number one. And then also if you could maybe cast ahead a little bit and describe, some of the near term, midterm, where this is going and why it matters.
Yeah, I would say so a couple things. I mean, one, I think we as a field need to acknowledge where there are limitations and where there are potential issues with the tools that we're advocating for use, right? I think it does a great disservice if vendors, and I'm speaking now about vendors, if vendors show up and pitch a solution and don't acknowledge where there are potential limitations to it. One that I think needs to be acknowledged, I think many realize, large language models there's a concept of hallucination. They
Mm.
will make
Mhm.
up facts and figures, and convincingly so. And in fact, as models get better and better, it is increasingly more convincing where it
Mm.
is hard for a user without doing some deep fact checking to recognize where the model is just making something up. It's just convincing BS. We do a disservice as industry working in the DIB when we oversell the capabilities. We need to be honest brokers in what it can and cannot do. That is not to say that it's the sky is falling and we can't use LLMs. I think quite the contrary. I think there's a ton of opportunity. We just need to be very open about where there are limitations and not make claims that far outpace the reality of the output that these things can produce. I think that's sort of table stakes. Um, I do see there is a ton of research on that is happening, not only within, it's a lot of fascinating research coming out of DARPA on the AI side of the house, but just within industry across the board in academia on techniques for improving the overall output, ways that we can speed up, model generation, ways that these models can be distilled into very, very small models that still have really outsized impact. A lot of focus on how can you make models work with multilingual inputs and outputs. A lot of models can do that, but getting into low density languages and places like that where it truly can be, I think, a democratizing capability where it does not matter the language that you speak. You will be able to converse and get knowledge in and out of these systems. Um, and I think there's just a ton of there's a lot of blue ocean, if you will, on
Mhm.
on where this tech can go. We just have to be very cognizant of the limitations and and not fall into the trap of over promising and under delivering, so that especially in this early part of the adoption curve, we don't turn off a lot of potential adopters because we've promised something that we can't deliver. So I think
Yeah.
that more than anything is probably what will help us. The collective space advance is being very transparent on that front.
Yeah, cool. Do you have any thoughts about where this is going over the next, say, 5 years?
Oh man, humans are notoriously bad at prediction. I think
Okay.
the one thing that we're consistent at is we're consistently bad at being accurate in our predictions. I will say I can, even though this is maybe a bit of a folly to point to recent history to predict the future, but here's an interesting observation. So I started building this tool, StoryForge, that some of the users may have heard of or used. Started building it. I think my first code commit was in like December of 23. There is not a single model that is in the system today that existed when I started.
Mm.
The
Hmm.
pace at which these models are being produced, and there are more than 100 models that are employed in the system. Everything from language to LLMs to image generation to adapters, et cetera. Not a single model, not one of them, existed when I started started developing it. The
Hmm.
pace at which these models are improving, both in terms of output and in the hardware in which we can deploy them, is also dramatically improving. Most of my work is done on commercial hardware that you can go and pick up at the Apple Store, and you can get really high quality results without having to rely on some of these very, very large computationally intensive models. At the same token, these large computational models, and I'll point to Sonnet 3.7 from Anthropic. I think it's fundamentally changing, and will continue to change the landscape of software development. In particular, I mentioned that a little bit earlier,
Yeah, yeah.
where it is now, what would have taken um, tons and tons of engineers, teams of engineers to build tools, can now be done by very, very small agile teams. So I think there's going to be quite a disruption to the agile development approach. I think there's going to be a lot of disruption to what technology teams look like. I mean, I can even point to ZenithFlow. We are three people. There is one software engineer. It's me.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and uh, and and it's not because I'm such a magical software developer. In fact, I didn't even know how to write code until a couple of years ago when I decided I was going to go and teach a course on it. Um, but the way in which these types of tools can help accelerate the development, I think, is going to fundamentally change. So I think you're going to see a lot more of these micro SaaS companies, if you will, even though I know SaaS is specific to a delivery method, but micro software development companies where very small numbers of people can generate high quality and deliver high quality products and do so without having these enormous investments behind them. And it really does open up the door for bootstrapped companies where you don't have to take outside capital, you don't have to raise a bunch of money to be able to solve a particular problem. And that's that's where I think it's going, which actually ties in. I know that one of the questions you'd asked me in advance was what's a good book to reference
Yep.
or
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So this one is not about large language models, but I'll sort of throw out two on there. If you want to learn about large language models, I think one of the single most active communities I have found is a subreddit. It's called Local Llama. So a little plug for the Local Llama subreddit. So that's
Okay.
local and then llama, LLAMA, all one word. If you look for that one, that has an enormous amount of high quality content in there. Now the slant is focused on models that can be deployed locally, but that a lot of knowledge is in there from what's largely just a bunch of people that really are fascinated by what these models can do locally. A lot of goodness that comes out of that one. The other, actually, more to my point on the small sort of micro SaaS or micro companies, was actually a book that I picked up a couple of years ago that really started to resonate with me about the type of company that I was interested in building. And that book is called Company of One. It's by an author named Paul Jarvis. And that one was really about, I'd seen and been through a couple of different recent experiences with both venture capital and private equity-backed companies. I talked with owners and founders who had gone through the process of raising capital and what that did in terms of control and the challenges that came with it. I had sat through countless board meetings on just seeing what was important to the investors and all of that. And Company of One was really a book that said, what if we challenge the prevailing growth at all cost business mentality? What if instead of trying to grow to scale, you focused on staying small as a deliberate strategy rather than as a stepping stone? And Paul goes on to talk through this, how do you start small, define what growth means for you, building a business around your life rather than your life for your business, and for a Company of One, really focusing on elegant solutions to real problems, and then developing deeper customer relationships is far more important than trying to be this enormous entity that does all things to all people. Now, it's not for everyone, certainly.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
business philosophy is not for everyone, but it really resonated with me where the thing I'm fundamentally driven by are solving hard problems. I love this. I love this space. When I started really in 2008. I realized that this was the space I was meant to be in all along. That even though it's relatively niche, and I think it is still niche compared to any of the other sort of warfighting domains or warfighting functions or organizations within DoD, et cetera. But I really, really like solving the hard problems in the information space. I really like the idea of building a company that's committed to solving those problems and building really deep customer relationships to solve those problems, and eschew the idea that growth at all costs is the model. Growth should come. At the end of the day, companies have to get capital and have revenue to be able to stay around, but that is not the only measure of success.
All right. Wow. Holy cow. Well, Carrick, this has been a fantastic gallop across the LLM landscape, and as I said back up at the top, this is going to fill a glaring void in the Cognitive Crucible corpus, and you've certainly done that, given our audience a lot to think about. And I agree with you totally. You're in a really interesting space with no shortage of problems and interesting solutions that are being developed. So good on you and your colleagues for the work that you're doing. And with that, Dr. Carrick Longley, thank you for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.